Don't know if that worked, but we'll see. Hi there. My name is Jack Wallen. You remember me, right? From the last time you and I spoke? Surely you do. Do I have to introduce myself again? Well, I just did, so. So, I want to talk about the one surefire trick to help make your story sing to the heavens, or just be really good. Be successful. Well, okay, success is relative, so you've got to, you know what I mean. You can't assume that this one trick is all of a sudden going to make you a best-selling author because, well, you know, there are a lot of factors that go into that. That's not what we're talking about. Okay, so if you asked me, if you came up to me and said, hey, Jack, would you please distill it down for me, the single most important aspect of writing a story, regardless of what that story is. That story could be a book, it could be a television script, a film script, a memoir, a theater script. It could even be a song, maybe a concept album. You know what I'm talking about. Here's the answer that I would give you. And every artist needs to pay attention. Actually, I think this kind of applies to other art forms too. Painting, directing, of course, you name it. Okay, let's get to it, right? If you ask me that question, my answer would be thus. Relationships. Every good story comes down to relationships. Now, before you make any sort of assumption here, I'm not necessarily talking about romantic relationships, although, of course, romantic relationships are great for stories. Relationships could be of any sort, and let me give you a really good example. I'll give you a couple of good examples. First, I'll give you a couple of examples that have nothing to do with my work. Okay? Tom Hanks in a volleyball. Perfect, right? Tom Hanks had a relationship with an inanimate object, and it was absolutely riveting. But there was a relationship there. Now, granted, it developed over time and because of a specific reason, but it was important. It drove the story forward. Dr. Frankenstein and this obsessive desire to reanimate dead tissue. That's a relationship. Now, let's talk about my work. For example, Me and My Muse. Me and My Muse, the first episode, there are two relationships. The first relationship is the writer's relationship with the past. Because when the story starts, that is the only relationship he has left, is his tie to the past. And then, as the episode goes on, he develops a relationship with his muse. Two relationships. Two. Count them, two. And if it weren't for those relationships, the story would fall flat. I am halfway through Aftermath, which is my first ever sci-fi book. Okay, it's my first ever true sci-fi book because I've written a cyberpunk book and I've had steampunk books and I've got sci-fi elements in other books, but this is my first true sci-fi book. So when I first started to write this story, I knew that it wasn't going to be a typical sci-fi story. I didn't want to write Hail Mary. I didn't want to write another Star Trek or Star Wars. I wanted to write a sci-fi story that's unique to me. So immediately I knew that it would be all about relationships. Because from day one, relationships have always been the single most important part of a story for me. Now, in this story, there are a lot of relationships. And I'm not going to give much away because obviously I want you to read the story, but right out of the gate, you know that there is something bad going on, and because of that something bad, there has developed a relationship between bad people or bad things and the not so bad things or bad people. And that relationship is secondary to another relationship that is far greater and more dangerous. And that is the relationship humankind has with the planet. And that is the driving force of this story. Now, of course, along the way, other relationships develop. But it is important that before you start writing any story, you ask yourself this question: what is the primary relationship in this story? Is it a phone dropping to the floor? Is it two people? Is it a love relationship? Is it a hate relationship? Is it a challenging relationship? Is it one person and technology? Is it one person in the past? Is it one person in the future? Is it one person and nature? Is it humanity against nature? It goes back to that whole man versus man, man versus beast, man versus self, man versus machine. Those are, and I don't remember all of them, but those are the 7 basic plots. But if you look at those basic plots as relationships, the whole dynamic changes. Because you all of a sudden can say, oh, if it's man versus machine, you start the whole story out with what is man's relationship to machines. For example, the Matrix. Man's relationship to machines is that man acts as a battery to charge the machines. That's a relationship. That's a really frightening relationship. Another reason why we don't want the singularity to show up. Because I don't want to be a battery. I'm not against technology, but I don't want to be technology's bitch. You know what I'm saying? That was a bad word. I'm not used to you saying those in these videos. I apologize. If I offended anybody, I apologize. So, my point is that you should never start. You should never even write that first word until you know what the relationships are in the story. And I'm talking about all of them, because some of those relationships are going to start to develop as the story goes. I'm talking about what is the driving relationship of this story. Is it narrator versus time? That's an interesting one. The man against time. And I apologize, I should say humankind against time, because man implies, you know what I'm talking about. I could say woman against time. I could say woman against woman, or woman against machine. You know what I'm talking about. But the point is if you don't know what the driving relationship of that story is, it's going to fail. I don't necessarily mean it's going to fail. It's going to fail to become successful. I'm saying it's going to fail to become a totally realized, fleshed out, multidimensional story. Because without relationships, there is no dimension to a story. And the relationship could be as simple as the narrator and the reader. For example, my Shiro series. In the Shiro series, there is an inherent relationship between the narrator and the reader, because the narrator directly addresses the reader frequently. The narrator, the Shiro series there, it's multi-layered, because the narrator not only directly addresses the reader, but the narrator also addresses the writer. That's me. So You can bend and twist exactly what a relationship is to meet your needs, but it has to be there, and it has to be important, and it has to be solidified, and it has to be multidimensional. It's like I introduced in the or very early on, second chapter, I think, in Aftermath, I introduced two characters. And those two characters, I needed for them to hit the ground running. I needed the reader to know almost immediately that these two had a long-standing relationship. What is that relationship? You don't know at first. It starts to unfold as we go along. And you start to realize that these two people have to be with each other. I'm not have to be, but they desperately want to be with each other. And I'm not talking about in a romantic way. Their survival is dependent on one another. And so I knew that those two were going to be central characters. I didn't know how at first, but I knew that they were going to be central characters. The how revealed itself to me around chapter 10 or so. And there was a reason why it took that long. But the nice thing is once their purpose was shown to me, I had already developed this deep, meaningful relationship between these two people. So that when they start to take the journey together, it had even more meaning. And the reader would be rooting for them to succeed in whatever it is that they are going to do. And there are all sorts of different relationships in this story. And the more relationships you can develop, the better. But the thing is those relationships have to be fleshed out. You can't just say, they're boyfriend and girlfriend, husband and wife, boyfriend and boyfriend, girlfriend and girlfriend. Don't make generic relationships, because if you make generic relationships, you're going to write a generic story. And if you write a generic story, nobody's going to want to read it. So the deeper your relationships, the more meaningful the relationships, the easier the reader will have a relationship with the book and the story. See how that goes? So again, let me reiterate this. Before you start writing a story, before you put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard, ask yourself that one question. What is the driving relationship in this story? And once you've answered that question, then you can start writing. And here's another little trick. As you're writing, if you run into an issue, you run into a situation where you're like, oh, I don't know what to do. I don't know where to take the story. Ask yourself, what about the story is getting in the way of a relationship? And if you discover that, then you ask yourself, how do I use that relationship to fuel the next right turn, left turn, whatever of the story? The meaning is oh so clear. Anyway, thank you again very, very kindly for taking a brief little moment here to listen to me blather on about my writing process. Hopefully, I've helped you a little bit, because that's really all I care about doing with these videos. It's just helping. I want to help you to become the best artist that you can. And by association, the best human you could become. So, one last thing. I would ask you today to do an anonymous good deed. Doesn't have to be big, be teeny tiny, doesn't matter. Just make it anonymous. Do something good for somebody else. Anyway, I hope that you and everyone you know and love have a wonderful, wonderful day.